This is a group of high-powered intellectuals, so I think I'm going to engage you with that in mind. I know that you have now behind you a couple of sessions, and my colleagues were just briefing me that one of the points of tension may be around the issue of the macroeconomic framework that is adaptable to the ambitions that we have, and one that will address both the needs for industrialization and, in the case that Mario is just mentioning, the issues of inclusion and how the tension can build around what comes first. And I'm very pleased to be here with Minister Arkebe. Minister Arkebe is not just an intellectual in his own right and one of the best that we have in the continent on these issues, but also a practitioner. So by being completely involved in making policy implementable, it's going to be very interesting to hear from him, even more so because Ethiopia is a beacon of growth with transformation, because you have a lot of growth in the continent, but not necessarily transformation. And what really matters is this quality growth that is also including the element of structural transformation. And that is happening in Ethiopia. There are many examples we keep referring about Ethiopia, but it's better to hear from one of the persons that is actually putting these policies together. But let me give you first my imperatives for Africa to do industrialization. And I'm going to do it very quickly because probably you covered some of this territory in your previous sessions, and it's more or less a known dimension for those who are familiar with the African context. In the next 10 years, we need to create 122 million jobs if we take into account the demographic curve and the requirements of the labor market increase and so on. 120 million jobs is quite a daunting task. If we were to do exactly as we have been doing in the last 15 years, growing at an average of about 5%, and the kind of policy mix that we have in the continent, and I'm not referring to a country in particular, we would create about 54 million jobs. So it's obvious that we cannot continue to do business as usual. If we are going to really address this deficit, we have to be much more ambitious. And normally my point of comparison is India, because so far, every single indicator between India and Africa, and I'm referring to India because of its demographic size, obviously, it's bigger than Africa in demographic terms, every indicator is favorable to Africa. So we have a per capita that is higher than India, we have a size of world trade that is bigger than India. We have a compounded growth, if you take into account the 15 years, not 10 years, that is bigger than India. So our GDP has more than doubled. It's about to triple since 15 years past. So we have a number of factors that demonstrate that we were poised to do very well, and yet we know the magic number of 7% growth that is elusive in Africa and is what is required for us to move to a higher speed, is actually now present in India, but not in the continent. We have a few countries that are doing very well, including Ethiopia, but the majority are posting growth that will not get us to that level of ambition. So if we are, in one hand, celebrating growth and the fact that Africa, for the first time, is ahead of the world average and ahead of the developing countries' average, and yet we are conscious that we are coming from a very low base and we need to accelerate our efforts and level of ambition, we need to look into as much learning as we can to transform our productive structure, economic structure, much more faster in order to create the jobs that are going to miss in my calculation. And I think we are very cautious that if we look into the various frameworks that have been adopted in different regions, that we are latecomers insofar as industrialization is concerned. And when you are a latecomer, you have a lot of problems. For instance, we have intellectual property regimes that are extremely complex. And Africa now has to face that music. Others industrialized when it was not so. You have a trade negotiations and trade agreements and trade systems that have become extremely sophisticated. Others have industrialized when they could practice almost crude protectionism. Now, not only we have to practice smart protectionism, but we have to be very, very smart because the avenues are extremely limited. Then we have the very important and difficult issue of the value chains that have become globalized. So we can no longer produce anything from A to Z in the same place. We have to identify the niches where we can penetrate part of the chain. And you know, being at the very low end of the industrial value addition, we have major difficulties integrating any part of the chain without a lot of determination and a policy mix that is very, very sophisticated. And then we have the issue that most of our infrastructure that could have propelled part of this industrialization is missing. And that one that exists has been much more linked to the old colonial model of exporting our commodities raw, then transformed. So our ports, our railways, our roads, electricity systems are geared towards, you know, moving things to the ports so they can be exported raw, and not with an integration in the rest of the economy that will make transformation of value possible. So we have all these latecomer problems. And on top of all this, of course, we have competition. Others have already occupied the niches that are the most interesting. It's going to be very difficult to take them out of their very important control of certain circuits, markets, processes. And we have huge gaps, particularly on energy, that would be required for industrialization to take root, not to mention other factors that will be mentioned in the future much more than now, like adequacy of the educational systems. Although I think that for the value-end production, industrial production, we are fine, because I think the continent has better education capabilities than, say, Bangladesh or you know, even other countries in Asia, and they are receiving a lot of this manufacturing investment. So I think there is a bit of an exaggeration on the adequacy of education systems for now. It will be a big problem immediately after, but not now. We have 40% of Africans that have secondary degree education, so we can work on that mass. So latecomers, with all these problems, do we have a chance? Do we stand a chance? And Africans are saying, yes, we do, because there are a number of megatrends favoring Africa. The demographic megatrend, of course, the youthness, the urbanization, the labor force that is going to be the largest by 2040, the fact that we are going to have a consumer market that is going to be quite big internally, so we can look more inside Africa itself. So that megatrend is by far the most important. But then the second latecomer advantage is that when you are a latecomer, you learn from the others, you don't need to do the same mistakes. And one of the things you can do, obviously, is to leapfrog. Leapfrog, for instance, on energy mix, because we can go straight into renewables, because we have the potential. Prices have gone down for the production out of renewables, so we can be greening our electricity from the start. We are not married to any particular platform so far, the majority of the countries, with 160 gigawatts of production, we are really producing as much as half of the electricity of Japan, which means that they consume 20 times more than us if we take into account the population. So we have a long way to go, and we can use renewables to do that. And again, you know, I hope Minister Arkebe will tell you about Ethiopian experience, because very interesting. Another one is the leapfrogging of technologies. Now you can have cleaner technologies for a number of productive sectors, and we can tap into those. But we have to be very realistic. What are the 3 entry points for industrializing the continent? I think there are only 3. One is linked to commodities, transforming and valuing our commodities more. But if we think we are going to do it in massive scale, it's not going to happen. But if we just add about 10 to 15% value addition, it's a big victory, because right now it's quite low. It's about 10%. Second is to take advantage of delocalization in Southeast Asia by bringing manufacturing that is going to be too difficult to maintain there for competitive reasons into Africa. And I'm sure the minister will elaborate. And third is agro-processing, because we consume about 83% of our processed food from imports. And that is just unacceptable. And it's a huge opportunity to pull productivity from the agricultural sector, to make sure that we take into account our market. And because of the less sophisticated needs for agro-processing in many areas, it is possible for our own entrepreneurs, private sector, to venture into that area first and create a lot of value, a lot of employment out of it. And it's within reach. So we have these 3 entry points. And for each one of these 3 entry points, we need the policy incentives, the macroeconomic frameworks that are going to make this possible. Now, if we are going to take into account what is happening right now in Africa, and we compare it with any other region of the world, we'll say we have the best macroeconomic framework of the world. There is no doubt about it. You know, we have the least debt of the world. We have control over the inflation. We have all-time historic reserves of central banks. This year it's going down because of the commodity super cycle headwinds, but until last year it was all-time high. We never had as much investment as we are getting. We are breaking a record every year. Right now we have more investment per year than, say, India. So the macroeconomic fundamentals look pretty. And they look so pretty that, you know, a country like Algeria has more central bank reserves than Russia. Or, you know, a country like Angola goes to the market under bad weather with all the elements of its sort of economy related to oil being on the downside, and gets 7 times subscription of sovereign debt issuing. So there is no doubt that those who are in the know, the specialists, see this, the best macroeconomic indicators. But the reality of the world doesn't work like that. The reality of the world is political. And I think it's very important for our discussion, because I was told, you know, macroeconomic fundamentals is one of the points of tension. Now, the problem is that we tend to think that having good macroeconomic equilibria is necessarily just following the recipes from Bretton Woods. And that is very wrong. And I'll tell you what is wrong. You just need to read the newspapers from yesterday. You go and, you know, read the Financial Times of yesterday, New York Times of yesterday about Ukraine. You know what happened in Ukraine this week. Probably you have read it. So the IMF has decided to change its rules to accommodate a political decision that will not oblige Ukraine to follow the principle of paying its creditors, and it changed the rule because of Ukraine. Now, what is interesting is that Ukraine in the first place should not have received 1 penny from the IMF because it didn't meet any of the criteria. But it did receive as much as all of Africa. This is a country of 45 million. And yet, even with that extreme favor of receiving $6 billion, which was the amount that Africa got last year, as much as Ukraine, even when these rules for criteria were not applied, it couldn't fulfill, because it was obvious it wouldn't fulfill its obligations, and then the rules are actually changed by the board just to accommodate Ukraine. That's the reality of the world, is that the Ukrainians will always be protected. An African can have the best indicators, and it will always be seen as not enough. You know, you will say that a country like Angola or a country like Nigeria should have a debt sustainability ratio of around 35% of GDP, which is extremely low. You know, we know Japan is 200%, and it's fine because, you know, part of the debt is domestic, and the macroeconomic dimensions of Japan are not the same as a small emerging economy. That is true. But there is flexibility. And when we engage the IMF here at ECA about these issues, you know, we were very surprised that they concede the point. They say it is a point to be discussed, these debt sustainability ratios. Another point that has to be discussed is how come, you know, the central bank reserves of Africa that have about $500 billion invest all this money abroad in, you know, US Treasury bills, Euro bonds, and AAA financial vehicles, which happen to be vehicles that don't invest in Africa. So which means that all these savings are not invested in the continent. Can we discuss other ways of using this particular amount of money? And I'm going to finish with that point about financing, because all of these issues that I've been raising, they have become rather consensual in the continent. I don't think there are those who are practicing, those who are just talking about it, but there is no real big controversy. Some don't articulate it exactly the way I did, but overall there is consensus about industrialization. It is reflected in all the decisions of our leaders. But I think what is interesting is that people still believe that this is going to happen with resources from outside. And the resources from outside are very important, don't take me wrong. But the most difficult transformation is actually to tap into domestic resources, because they are there. Africa is full of money, but doesn't use the money properly. Just the pension funds have $620 billion. Only about 20% of this money is used properly. The rest is a complete mess. Banks in Africa don't break because they go way beyond Basel III requirements. They have a lot of money, they do nothing with it, they sit on it, because they just lend to the government with treasury bills, and that's it. They make their buck. Why should they be engaging with small, medium enterprises? And it's too confusing, so they just don't do it. Then you have the issue of how we are managing our sovereign debt itself. You know, sometimes denominating it in dollars and then suffering the consequences of it. The way we are advised on contract negotiation for our commodities. You can go on with the list. Our study on illicit financial flows show that we lose about $50 to $60 billion a year on illicit flows. In Latin America, it's much higher than that. But, you know, the bottom line is this. Every single one of these tracks require very firm government policy. requires that the government be a bit more interventor than some like. And I think this is the debate that we have to have, because we need to learn from each other. So we have the best policy mix, and we have the best recommendations coming out of lessons learned. But the level of ambition, that's where I started, has to be much higher. And I think when the Chinese say that they are going to delocalize about 82 million jobs, we, with our deficit, are looking into those and see how many of those are coming our way. And they will only come if we create the right conditions, attractiveness. But we also have to fight risk perception that has been associated with Africa wrongly by constructing a new narrative and telling the story differently, putting the numbers out, demonstrating that if we are not ready for business in terms of every single aspect of the policy mix, we are certainly getting there. And I think meetings like this will allow us to beef up our capabilities in terms of making the case for governments in Africa, but also other economic actors, to be much more ambitious and much more influential. Thank you.
The last one, Annalise.
Thank you, Mario. Just as a co-organizing organization of this debate, just to say that it has been fascinating to hear both speeches, and I would like to make comments, but I'm not going to do it because we are late. But I want to ask two questions. One to Executive Secretary Carlos. I mean, thinking of we as international organizations, and I think this event today shows that we are strongly building partnerships to foster this dialogue and to make the development agenda advancing in a very pragmatic and concrete way. But my question for you is, what do you think we can do more? Because we know we are already doing things, but what we can do more through these partnerships together to deliver better advices to countries? Because here we are seeing a strong demand, and I think there is a lot that we could mobilize together in the future. So what would be your take on that? And to the Minister Arkebets, first to open an invitation to have a keynote ministerial address from you in Paris at the OECD, because we would really like to hear this story and bring it to the forum that we have with Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the OECD countries. And in particular, a specific question. You showed us a wonderful success case, and I think, I mean, you're reading about, okay, we are experimenting, we are learning by doing, and we also want to learn from the others. And it's fascinating to look at it and to hear the story about it. What do you see about the future? So what's next? What do you see as the major, you mentioned the challenge of environment that we cannot forget, but can we identify what is next more specifically, or where do you see the major challenges for the future? Thanks.
Thank you. It's always fascinating to hear the minister. So I'm going to do a commercial, which is for you to buy his book, Made in Africa, that has been released a few months back by Oxford University Press, that will give you much more details about the experience of industrialization in Ethiopia and lessons that can be used by other countries. I think it's really a must-read for people like us that are discussing these issues, in case you have not come across the book. I think the question that I had was about the role that institutions, international institutions, can play. But before I go to that, I really want to stress the point that we have to capture lessons from many parts of the world, including from our colleagues here present in Latin America. But we also are very conscious that as latecomers, we'll have to do things slightly different. And this is why examples like Ethiopia are very important for us to understand, because the level of ambition is the right one. It's very interesting that this year, if you look into the countries that are going to grow the most in Africa, almost all of them are non-oil producers. So this is very interesting paradox. So the top countries in terms of growth are all non-oil producers, and all the oil producers are going to the bottom of the list. And I think this is a lesson about, doing the right things when the weather is fine. So you prepare for bad weather. And I think it's also a lesson in terms of how we can transform and diversify the economies in a much more aggressive way. Let me tell you that we at the ECA have produced already 3 reports on industrialization. We did one on commodity-based industrialization, another one on industrial policies, a third one on industrialization through trade. And we are just about to release, it was actually almost going to happen in this meeting, another report on smart industrialization, which has been done with the collaboration of Ajun Chang, for those who know. And then in March, we are going to publish a report on green industrialization case for Africa. So the combination of all these different contributions, plus assessments that have been done on industrialization potential in Africa, and also experiences like Made in Africa book by Minister Arkebe, are a very good, solid basis for us to engage governments with very specific policy recommendations and how it can be done. I'm very pleased to tell you that insofar as we are concerned, 2 economic communities, SADC and East African Community, have already benefited from this engagement on our side and have put together industrial policies. The SADC one has already been approved by the heads of state. The Eastern African Community is under discussion. And there are about 12 countries in Africa that have engaged in very serious discussions on industrial policy. And I know the minister, you have been just to Rwanda, which is one of the countries with whom we are working on aggressive industrial policy. And I think the lessons on industrial policy in Latin America in this context are extremely valuable, and also the ones from Southeast Asia. And we are tapping into that knowledge. So organizations like ours and others, Annelies, are supposed to facilitate this knowledge sharing as much as possible. So we build on the best practices. But we have also to create conditions for policy space, a point that the minister mentioned in his introduction and then also in his comments. I think it's very important for us to look into why the policy space is shrinking. The policy space is shrinking because some of the structural problems of the world economy are not being addressed. One structural problem of the world economy is obviously the way the financial sector has taken over in terms of power, influence, and also illicit forms of engagement. And you know this from Lehman Brothers, but we know also all the fights that are taking place in terms of regulatory systems wanting to impose to one another, and the fight is just going on. The second structural problem is, of course, demographics. When Europe says it's in crisis and wants to create more jobs, wants to do this, wants to do that, they don't want to admit that there is an aging population factor that doesn't allow the social security systems to be maintained and the rest. So these problems are not addressed up front. When the third structural problem is the way, the WTO, is collapsing, because instead of having a global trade regimes, you are having all kinds of lateral pacts that are being constructed, and it's becoming more and more interesting for the different pacts not to let one world pact prevail. So we just, keep kidding ourselves, but that's basically what is going on. So it's a retrocess in relation to advances that have been possible in the past. And finally, another very important structural factor is the fact that, we have climate change not being taken seriously. And we are just seeing it in Paris. I'm coming from Paris. There's all this discussion about the $100 billion that are supposed to be devoted to adaptation, and there is no agreement to approve it, and so on. $100 billion will be fine for Ethiopia, but not for the world. It's very little. It's a drop in the bucket. And just saving one bank in Europe costs more than that, and the money is found. So the discussion is not very serious in terms of the structural impacts and consequences, and we are leaving them through many fronts, including some provoking conflict because of environmental stress. Because part of the conflicts that we have in Africa are the problem of pastoralists not adapting to modern economies and therefore being available for all kinds of other uses of their expertise, in this case trafficking and sometimes conflict. So I think we are really not addressing the structural issues. And because we are not, policy space is shrinking. And how do we make sure that we at least protect the policy space that has already been conquered by Africa? By being very determined politically. So I'm going to respond to one of the questions, I think it was from Uganda, that the minister didn't respond directly. I don't think he was skipping it, which is the issue of political leadership, and how we mobilize the political leadership. I know he's not skipping it because it's very close to his heart. And this is what has been driven in the past, some of the transformations that were the most successful. And this is also what is driving success in Ethiopia, is very determined leadership. But it's a leadership that has to be really pragmatic. It's a leadership that is very much linked to what I'd like to say predictability. And we can call it planning, but planning is being overused as a word. So I'm trying to just put another varnish into it, but it's about that. It's about being strategic. But in this case, the predictability that Ethiopia offers is a guarantor of a number of transformations that are taking place. It's like, to use the analogy of the minister that, you can create your own comparative advantages. One of the comparative advantages created by Ethiopia is that it has become a beacon of predictability. So investors come and other partners come, and therefore, through that determination, it protects the policy space. So at least the issue here is to tell more about this to the rest of the world, create the opportunities for the narrative about Africa to change, create the opportunities for this different version of what actually works and what needs to be done to be told, and to basically create, through policy space, the level of ambition that Ethiopia has demonstrated, and a few other countries are demonstrating in Africa, and we hope the numbers will increase as we go along. So thank you.